Good afternoon, and welcome to the Nantucket Book Festival and this afternoon's reading by Robert Pinsky. Very happy to see you here. We've had great turnouts today, and it gladdens our hearts because you are the lifeblood of this festival. You keep us going, and we keep all of you in mind when we're planning for this festival throughout the year. I want to thank our major sponsors who give us such sustenance. The Nantucket Island Resorts, Steve and Jill Karp, the Nantucket Historical Association, the Dreamland Theater, the Nantucket Athenaeum, WCAI, N Magazine, the Inquirer and Mirror, Wendy Schmidt, and the Haft Foundation, without whose support we would not be able to offer so many of our events as free and open to the public. I hope at the end of the event you will avail yourself of the comment forms that volunteers will have downstairs, and also perhaps consider giving us a donation or a pledge, which we'd greatly appreciate. Robert will be available down there for signing, and his books will be on sale. I think that's the housekeeping info. If there is time and Robert is willing, we'll offer some time for Q&A. Okay, that's the easy part. I'm a bit intimidated, actually. I'm sorry to say. I'm usually pretty glib about these introductions, but some of you have been around for the weekend. You may have chatted with Robert or overheard him in conversation, and geez, the man's conversation deserves a running commentary. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce him. Robert Pinsky has an overarching presence in American poetry. As poet, as critic, essayist, teacher, translator, librettist, he is a force of nature. And he's currently teaching at BU, Boston University, and has taught other places, including Wellesley and UCal Berkeley. He has done translations of Czesław Miłosz and the Inferno of Dante, which many of you are probably familiar with. He has received honors. He's been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, for the Book Critics Circle Award. He won the William Carlos Williams Award from the Poetry Society of America, and many other awards. I wanted to say something about his poetry, and found myself having a tough time to decide just what to say. And so I'm just going to say a few words about a certain type of poem that Robert writes that I love and have loved since I first picked up his volume, An Explanation of America, which was the first book of his that I read, and I still go back to that because there's a poem called Bad Dreams in that book that I cherish. And the kind of poem I'm thinking about is a big poem. It's almost a raucous poem that he writes. It's a poem that sort of scans the future and goes ahead with its with its arms spread and gathers in bits of mythology, bits of family history, jokes, classical allusions, American history, and a rich panoply of allusions, and gathers all of those together to serve the purpose of the intention of the poem, which is a heartfelt concern. And those poems I really love, and I hope you'll seek them out and find them. He gathers and then he renders, and that's a great job. Would you please join me in welcoming Robert Pinsky?
Thank you all very much, and thank you, Dick, for an introduction that really pleases me very much. This is not just a perfunctory thank you by the guy who's going to talk. I am, of course, grateful to Dick and his fellow committee members and to this festival for inviting me here, but that he talked about my poems in terms of mixing that mythology, pop culture, highbrow things, lowbrow things, physical things, spiritual things. I'm a kind of a patriot of mongrelization. I like mixing very, very much, and I have always tended to be suspicious of purity in all its forms, and particularly culturally. I think that culture is by its nature something that changes. And Dick inspires me to begin a different way than I was going to begin. I was thinking originally of beginning with a couple of translations. Those of you who heard Maria Rana's inspiring talk about openness and open books and the relation of Peru and North America in her reading and in her two parents, Maria and I had a brief conversation where I talked about my philosophy of translation. She is saying that Faulkner may not be so well translated into Spanish, but he influenced all the Spanish writers from Colombia and Dominican Republic and Peru, Argentina. And I said, I think that the best translation that will ever be done of Faulkner's The Hamlet is Faulkner's English, and it's a translation of an original in the mind of God. No one will ever do a better translation of that Platonic original in the mind of God than Faulkner did in English. However, the Spanish translation, the Japanese translation, the Yiddish translation, the Swedish translation, each give a little more information about that original in the mind of God that even the English can't give, because it says this is how Swedish or Spanish needs to buckle and stretch and strain and change itself, depurify itself to accommodate the reality that is Faulkner. And that's how I felt about doing an English version of the Inferno of Dante. So inspired by Dick's description of that poem, I would read the poem from An Explanation for America, but I brought my selected. It's not in this selected. And I remember it well. It's a section that fantasizes about the possibility of a fascist regime coming to the United States of America. Me and my big imagination. In response to the introduction and in honor of it, I will read a poem from my most recent book, The Foundling Hospital. The poem is called Creole. Creole. I'm tired of the gods. I'm pious about the ancestors. Afloat in the wake widening behind them, those restless devisers. My father had one job from high school till the day he got fired at 30. The year was 1947, and his boss, planning to run for mayor, wanted to hire an Italian veteran, as he explained, putting it in plain English. I was 7. My sister was 2. The barbarian tribes in the woods were so savage, the empire had to conquer them to protect and clear its perimeter. So into the woods, Rome sent out missions of civilizing governors and forces to establish schools, courts, garrisons. Soldiers, clerks, priests, citizens with their household slaves. Years, decades, entire lives were spent in those hinterlands, which might be good places to retire on a government pension, especially if in your work years you had acquired a native wife. Often I get these things wrong, or at best mixed up, but I do feel piety toward those persistent, mixed families in Gaul, Britain, Thrace. When I die, may I take my place in the wedge widening and churning in the mortal ocean of years of souls. The Roman colonizing and mixing, the imperial processes of legal enslaving and freeing, involved not just the inevitable fucking in all senses of the word, but also marriages and births, as developers and barbers, scribes and thugs mingled and coupled with the native people and peoples. Begetting and trading, they had to swap, blend, and improvise languages. Couples especially needed to invent French, Spanish, German, those Creole languages. And I confess, I, Roman barbarian, I find that Creole work more glorious than God. The way it happened, the school sent around a notice. Anybody interested in becoming an apprentice optician, raise your hand. It was the Great Depression. Anything about a job sounded good to Milford Pinsky, who told me he thought it meant a kind of dentistry. Anyway, Milford was bored sitting in study hall, so he raised his hand, and he got the job, as was his destiny, full-time after he graduated from high school. Joe Chavone was the veteran who took the job, not a bad guy. Dr. Weinberg did get elected mayor. Joe worked for him for years. At the bank, John Smock, an Episcopalian whose family once owned the bank, had played sports with Milford, and he gave him a small loan with no collateral, so he opened his own shop, grinding lenses and selling eyeglasses. As his mother-in-law said, almost a professional. Optician comes from a Greek word that has to do with seeing. Banker comes from an Italian word for a bench, where people sat to make loans or change. Pinsky, like Tex or Brooklyn, is a name nobody would have if they were still in that same place. Those names all signify somebody who's been away from home for a while. Chavone, or Schiavone, means a Slav or slave. Milford is a variant on the poets' names, Milton, Herbert, Sidney, that certain immigrants used to give to their children. And Creole comes from a word meaning to breed or create in a place. I see on the facing page of the book, there's a poem called Mixed Chorus, which again picks up Dick Burns's introduction. I noticed at some point that in the Greek tragedies, The chorus speaks in the first person singular. They say I. It's a group of men chanting and sort of dancing. Apparently what they do is based on the way they fought in the military. So it's like the manual of arms. They made a human robot with their shields, and then they chant, and they thrust in unison. And even if you're bleeding to death, or you can barely stand, you keep the chant. And they speak as one in the first person singular. And my poem is in the first person singular, and it's spoken, a lot of it is plagiarized from the great American essayist W.E.B. Du Bois. But parts of it are also spoken by the composer Irving Berlin. And the poet Horace speaks some of it too. Horace, whose father was a slave. I know a slave didn't mean the same thing in Rome that it did in the American South, but still, Horace's father was a slave who somehow acquired means to buy his freedom. Probably sounds like the poem is 1,000 lines long. It's kind of short, and it is spoken by those people. Mixed chorus. My real name is Israel Bailin. My father was a Roman slave who gained his freedom. I was first named Ralph Waldo Ellison, but I changed it to the name of one of your cities because I was born a Jew in Belarusia. I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. My other name is Flaccus. I wrote an essay on the theme, You Choose Your Ancestors. It won't be any feeble, conventional wings that I'll rise on, not I, born of poor parents. Look, my ankles are changed already. New white feathers are sprouting on my shoulders. Those are my wings. Across the color line, I summon Aurelius and Aristotle. Threading through Philistine and Amalekite, they come, all graciously and without condescension. I took the name Irving, or Caesar, or Creole Jack. Someday, they'll study me in Hungary, in Newark, and L.A., so spare me your needless tribute. Spare me the red hideousness of Georgia. I wrote your white Christmas for you. And my third name, Burghardt, is Dutch. For all you know, I am related to Spinoza, Walcott, Pissarro. And in fact, my grandfather Burghardt's first name was Othello. And it's W.E.B. Du Bois's grandfather was named Othello Burghardt, which I like. That poem reminds me of a more recent poem, which I'll read, and then maybe I really will get to the Maria Arana's inspired idea of translations. This is a poem after the election in January. American Pen and an organization called Writers Resist decided to have a kind of a counter-inauguration on the steps of the New York Public Library. And they commissioned a poem they asked me to write a poem for the occasion. And I think I will read a couple of translations, and then I'll read the poem, which is related to what I just read to you. In my fantasy life, after I die, if I'm interviewed by a committee with Emily Dickinson, Homer, William Butler Yeats, Dante, Whitman, they say, it says here you write poem. What have you done? In my fantasy, one of the things I would think of doing for them is a translation I made from a language I don't really know. I read other translations of the poem. It's by the great Greek poet Constantine Cavafy. And I just felt I knew how the rhymes could fall. I knew Cavafy wrote in rhyme. And I will now read to you Cavafy's poem, Old Man, which is my attempt to live up to that idea of translation that I suggested, where you triangulate. You're creating something new. I mean, I'm not a translator in the sense of somebody who translates legal documents. For me, there's almost no difference at all between writing a poem or writing a translation. The only real difference is, in the translation, you don't have to think of what to say next. In every other way, it's the same thing. So I called this An Old Man After Cavafy. Back in a corner, alone in the clatter and babble, an old man sits with his head bent over the table, his newspaper in front of him, in the cafe. Sour with old age, he ponders a dreary truth. How little he enjoyed the years when he had youth, good looks and strength and clever things to say. He knows he's quite old now. He feels it. He sees it. And yet the time when he was young seems, was it yesterday? How quickly it slipped away. Now he sees how discretion has betrayed him, and how stupidly he let that liar persuade him with phrases. Tomorrow, there's plenty of time. Someday. He feels the pull of impulses he suppressed, the joy he sacrificed. Every chance he lost ridicules his brainless prudence a different way. But all these thoughts and memories have made the old man dizzy. He falls asleep, his head resting on the table in the noisy cafe. I always feel it's important to point out that that is very much a young man's idea of old age. Cavafy, 29 years old when he wrote the poem. Cavafy, gay, early in the 20th century, has a bureaucratic job in Alexandria, terrified of spending his life in the closet. So he projects his anxieties onto the old man who's thinking about his lottery ticket, or his grandchildren, or the waitress's legs. Cavafy translates the old man, in effect, into Cavafy's old man. And then I don't know Greek, I'm not gay, I'm in the 21st century, and I do my version of Cavafy's poem. And that's another sort of vertical example of what I mean by mixing. I'll read one other translation to you, then I'll go back to the inaugural poem. I had the honor and pleasure when I was in Berkeley of working with the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz. And Czesław and Renata Gorczynski would supply English versions of Polish poems. And my friend Bob Hass and I would come up with English. I always say we shouldn't be called translators, we should be called consultants in English idiom and rhythm. And this is another time, as with the Cavafy, where I felt I made an English poem out of this. You know, the sounds. It's just so physical. It's just that the melodies of the sentences, you sort of luck out just by coincidence almost. You find a way to do it. The poem is called Incantation. Incantation, from the Polish of Czesław Miłosz. I guess incantation doesn't mean he thinks this is how the world is. This is what you say to make the world become this. Incantation. Human reason is beautiful and invincible. No bars, no barbed wire, no pulping of books, no sentence of banishment can prevail against it. It establishes the universal ideas in language and guides our hand, so we write truth and justice with capital letters, lie and oppression with small. It puts what should be above things as they are. It is an enemy of despair and a friend of hope. It does not know Jew from Greek, or slave from master, giving us the estate of the world to manage. It saves austere and transparent phrases from the filthy discord of tortured words. It says that everything is new under the sun, opens the congealed fist of the past. Beautiful and very young are philosophia and poetry, her ally in the service of the good. As late as yesterday, nature celebrated their birth. The news was brought to the mountains by a unicorn and an echo. Their friendship will be glorious. Their time has no limit. Their enemies have delivered themselves to destruction. So I realize that I've read some poems to you that I very much lean on past poetry when I'm called upon to write an inaugural poem in 2017, in January of 2017. So in a way, I've supplied you all with the footnotes that you need for my poem. If you want to read this poem, it's the only poem of mine of which this is true, you can go to CNN Opinion on the web, and my poem is there on CNN Opinion. And it's the only poem I've ever published where the editors say, Robert Pinsky, blah, blah, blah. The opinions expressed are his. Indeed, they are. The poem is called Exile and Lightning. Exile and Lightning. You choose your ancestors. Our ancestor, Ralph Ellison, wrote. Now, fellow descendants, we endure a moment of charismatic indecency, sanctimonious greed. Our Polish grandfather, Miłosz, and our African-American grandmother, Gwendolyn Brooks, endured worse than this. Fight first, then fiddle, she wrote. Our great-great-grandmother, Emma Lazarus, wrote that the flame on the lamp of the mother of exiles is, quote, imprisoned lightning, end quote. Oh, my fellow children of exile and lightning, the indecency does construct its own statuary. But our uncle Ernesto Cardenal says, sabemos que el pueblo la derribará un día. The people will tear it down one day. Miłosz says, beautiful and very young, meaning recent, are poetry and philosophia, meaning science, her ally in the service of the good. Their enemies, he wrote, have delivered themselves to destruction. Un día, and very young, that long ancestral view of time. Inheritors, el pueblo, fellow exiles, all the quicker our need to fight and make music. As Gwendolyn Brooks wrote, to civilize a space. I'll give you the best line I have for you. It's the title of that poem by Ernesto Cardenal that I quote. Here's the title of the poem. Somoza dedicates Somoza's statue of Somoza at the Somoza Stadium. I know there are writers here. Don't you wish you had written something that had a title? Somoza dedicates Somoza's statue of Somoza at the Somoza Stadium. As I've said, the title of this recent book is At the Foundling Hospital. For me, it's related to the theme that I'm trying to link together, what I do for you. The foundling is an interesting idea to me. The foundling is an extreme, the abandoned infant is an extreme example of the way all of us come to a culture. You're a helpless infant, and we're going to give you a name that will have repercussions. You're going to have a religion. This is the language you're going to speak. Oh, your genitals. Oh, you have a vagina. You'll be assigned to be a woman. Oh, you have a penis. You'll be a man. Oh, and we're going to make you Jewish. We're going to cut off a little bit of it. That's the nature of culture. And then we each, having been found, the orphan is a word that has to do with what you lost, is behind you. And foundling has to do with what you will improvise with what's imposed upon you, what you will do next. There was an institution called the Foundling Hospital. The word hospital just means caretaking place. It doesn't necessarily mean for sick people. And in the 18th century in London, apparently there were many, many women who had infants that they had no help caring for. And they could leave the infant at the Foundling Hospital, and the infant would be fed and cared for. I've read that at that time, for those women, infanticide was a real possibility, sometimes practiced. Starvation was a real possibility. It's a serious thing. And to their credit, George Friedrich Handel, the musician, Edward Hogarth, the painter, gave works of art and money to the Foundling Hospital. And the peculiar custom at the Foundling Hospital is when you left a foundling, you left a token with it. Little brooch, bit of lace, and then they could look up the records and say, on that date, a shilling piece with a notch in it was left with an infant. And so, in theory, you identified the infant by the foundling token. There's now a foundling museum in London. And at the Foundling Museum, they have an exhibit of the tokens, often a piece of paper. You could write something. Many of them were poems. I mean, dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds. And I quote one of these poems in particular. I think it's just an incredibly precious, valuable, important, beautiful work of art. I quote it in my poem. My poem is called The Foundling Tokens. At the Foundling Hospital, for each abandoned baby, a duly recorded token. Bit of lace or a pewter brooch, identifying coin, button, or bangle. Crushed thimble, all noted at admission, or paper. At the Foundling Museum, a wall displaying hundreds of scraps, each pinned once to some one particular infant's nightie, nappy, or blanket. Each with surviving particulate ink or graphite in studied lines, betokening a life. Sometimes a name, by rule never to be used again for that foundling, and often verses quoted or composed. Quote, hard is my lot in deep distress, to have no help where most should find. Sure, nature meant her sacred laws should men as strong as women bind. Regardless he, unable I, to keep this image of my heart. 'Tis vile to murder, hard to starve, and death almost to me to part. If fortune should her favors give, that I in better plight may live, I'd try to have my boy again, and train him up the best of men. End quote. To have, meaning to reclaim, but also in the mind to have again that same foundling, paternity regardless, the same boy again, reconceived. Token, meaning a least irreducible particle of meaning, or token meaning token black, token woman, token gesture. They sent the infant foundlings to wet nurses, most of them out in the country. The foster mother, by contract, after a few years, returned the child ready for schooling to the foundling hospital. Unconsulted but retained the relic syllables of a name or lines, bauble or needlework. On the slave passage, some Africans inscribed their true names into the hull as though someday to be pronounced again. And the Chinese immigrants in the Dark Angel Island internment cells of San Francisco, many to be deported, wrote verses founded in the walls above their bunks. Fragments of a tune or a rhyme or name, mumbled from memory, incised into a bar of soap, or even scraped into the very death compound dirt, or hut dirt, or chalked onto pavement, scratched or smeared or intoned betokening. Or in the ordinary plight of insomnia, reciting memorized avenues through the expanses of loss, although almost never was a foundling reclaimed, ever. I'll read another poem from this book that I think deals with the same material of culture. It's a friend of mine had a brain. It was a car accident. He'd been taking blood thinner, and he's wiped out up there. And when you're in a coma, friends and family sometimes, for a certain period, will sing to you, recite to you, talk to you, and sometimes the result is the person comes back. And sometimes you do it, it's not effective. And in this poem, I'm trying to think about all the culture I share with a very close friend of mine, an eminent writer that I grew up with. We knew one another when we were teenagers. And the poem is called In the Coma. My friend was in a coma, so I dove deep into his brain to word him back. I tried to sing Hallelujah, I Just Love Her So in Ray Charles's voice. Of course, the silence grew. I couldn't sing the alphabet song. My voice couldn't say words I knew. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. I couldn't remember the Dodgers and the Giants. I tried to tell him the stories he and I studied when we were young. It was confused. The invisible man was laughing at how a man felt history jump out of his thick, fair head and beat him half to death, as that being the nightmare out of which Isaac Babel was trying to awake. The quiet. Next time, won't you sing with me? Those great diminished chords. A girl I knew. The cold of the coma, lightless. The ocean floor. I struggled to tell things back from decades gone. That mournful American soldier testifying about My Lai, quote, I shot the older lady, end quote. Viola Liuzzo, Spiro Agnew, Jim Jones. And by the time I count from 1 to 4, I hear her knocking. Quiet of the deep. Our mouths are open, but we cannot sing. I'll read 2 more poems to you, and I would love there to be a Q&A. I like Q&A. I'll read 1 more poem from this new book at the Foundling Hospital, and then I'll close with a poem filling a request. Grief. Grief. I don't think anybody ever is really divorced, said Lenny. Also, I don't think anybody ever is really married, he said. Because English was really Lenny's second language, and because of Yiddish and its displaced place in the world, he never really believed in his own prose. He wrote sentences the way a great boxer moves. Near the end, he told me, "I'm in hell," something Lenny might have said about hunting for a parking space in Berkeley. Mike, too, was himself. His last month, too weak to paint or make prints, he sat and made drawings of flowers, ink attentive to rhythms of beach rose, wisteria, lily, forms like acrobats or Cossack dancers. Mike had a vision of his body dead on his studio floor, seen from high above. He didn't feel sad or afraid at seeing it, he said, just sorry for the person who would find it. You can't say nobody ever really dies. Of course they do. Mike died. Lenny died. But the odd thing is, the person still makes a shape distinct and present in the mind as an object in the hand. The presence in the absence. It isn't comfort, it's grief. I'll read one more poem to you, and no pressure. If there's no questions, we'll be fine too. But shirt. The back, the yoke, the yardage, lapped seams. The nearly invisible stitches along the collar turned in a sweatshop by Koreans or Malaysians gossiping over tea and noodles on their break, or talking money or politics, while one fitted this arm piece with its overseam to the band of cuff I button at my wrist. The presser, the cutter, the ringer, the mangle, the needle, the union, the treadle, the bobbin, the code, the infamous blaze at the Triangle Factory in 1911. 146 died in the flames on the 9th floor. No hydrants, no fire escapes. The witness in a building across the street who watched how a young man helped a girl to step up to the windowsill, then held her out away from the masonry wall and let her drop. And then another, as if he were helping them up to enter a streetcar, and not eternity. A third, before he dropped her, put her arms around his neck and kissed him. Then he held her into space and dropped her. Almost at once, he stepped to the sill himself. His jacket flared and fluttered up from his shirt as he came down, air filling up the legs of his gray trousers, like Hart Crane's bedlamite, shrill shirt ballooning. Wonderful how the pattern matches perfectly across the placket and over the twin bar-tacked corners of both pockets, like a strict rhyme or a major chord. Prints, plaids, checks, houndstooth, tattersall, madras, the clan tartans invented by mill owners inspired by the hoax of Ashen to control their savage Scottish workers, tamed by a fabricated heraldry. McGregor, Bailey, McMartin, the kilt devised for workers to wear among the dusty, clattering looms. Weavers, carders, spinners, the loader, the docker, the navvy, the planter, the picker, the sorter sweating at her machine in a litter of cotton as slaves in calico head rags sweated in fields. George Herbert, your descendant is a black lady in South Carolina. Her name is Irma, and she inspected my shirt. Its color and fit and feel and its clean smell have satisfied both her and me. We have culled its cost and quality down to the buttons of simulated bone, the buttonholes, the sizing, the facing, the characters printed in black on neckband and tail, the shape, the label, the labor, the color, the shade, the shirt. Thanks. I promise you that I will try to answer respectfully anything anybody says. I mean, I will answer respectfully. Yes, ma'am. The question is about when people translate my poems. I just got back. I was in Poland last week for a week, and I met. There's a volume of my poems, selected poems, coming out. Just came out in Polish from Znak, a very good publisher in Poland, and I met five. There are 5 translators, and they're doing a great thing, which is that each of them wrote an afterword, which they're going to translate. I haven't read them yet, but each has a different perspective on the poetry. And the one language where I have felt capable of helping translators was when Andrés Catalán and Luis, I'm forgetting one of the guy's names, the guy who I know better. Anyway, I know Spanish well enough to make suggestions. Optician is optico or not, and which is the right word for an ophthalmologist or an optician, slang. I have one poem with a lot of obscenities in it, and they had a good time seeing which should there be Mexican obscenity, because a word that might be perfectly innocent in Argentine Spanish is obscene in Mexican in reverse. And I think they settled on Mexican, in fact, is the source of it. And mostly from working with Czesław Miłosz, especially, whose English was excellent, I learned that you're probably better erring on the side of, you do it. I made suggestions for the title of the new and selected the poems in Polish, and they said, may not sound good in Polish. And one of my poems has the phrase, a terrarium of dreams, and I can't say it in Polish, but it's called that. And I said, do it your way, do what you say. And every time we came to that, I said, whatever sounds good in Polish. And you know, we can worry later about whether someone wants to find out whether it's how literal or how, because there's no such thing as translation. You know, translatere, carrying across, can't happen. I always say about my Inferno, a better word for what it did, I tried to do a very faithful, accurate Englishing of Inferno. So my policy generally is hands-off, although I think there were 5 or 6 suggestions I made that were incorporated into the Spanish published by Vasorotto.
So I think we're saying the other night, we were talking about, first of all, it's such a pleasure to hear you read, and you have an amazing voice. And I wanted to know about, say a little bit, I think that was for you, not for the question. I wanted to know if you could say more about, I think you said something to the effect of, you know, your words give the reader voice. I'm butchering it, but talking about...
This is very important. Thank you, Björn. Thank you. It's very important to me. I'll exaggerate a little bit. I'm exaggerating. If you say to me, oh, I love how you read your poems. You have such a nice voice. I love it. I read them myself. I didn't get anything out of them. There's hardly any bigger insult. That's terrible. I'm not a performer. I'm not an actor. I don't want you to like the way I read my poems for itself. I'm hoping I'm giving you a hint of what you might be hearing. And I believe that the greatest defect in reading of poetry, generally, is a failure to read with your ears. People start giving themselves an exam. What does that mean? Worry about, don't start studying the score. Listen to the music. I'm trying to give you a hint of what I think I'm doing. You should test it with your own voice. I write with my voice for your voice. And I'm going to give you a website that I very, very strongly recommend. Favorite poem, singular, favoritepoem.org. No poets there, no professors of poetry, no actors. You'll see a construction worker, a guy who works for Boston Gas, reading Walt Whitman aloud and saying very cogent things about Whitman. You'll see a Jamaican immigrant, black guy from Jamaica, reads Sylvia Plath's Nick and the Candlestick very beautifully and talks about why, different as they are as people, why her poem speaks to him and indeed through him. Poetry cannot show images as well as video. Poetry cannot create emotion as immediately and reliably as music. Sexy music, sad music, martial music, we get it right away. Poetry can't convince people the way a great preacher or politician can. But poetry is uniquely powerful in that it gets into the audience. The reader's body is the ultimate medium for a poem. So when you see that Jamaican guy reading Plath, he is Plath's medium. They're collaborating together on that happening of the poem. And that's why poetry is so fundamental. The only technology is the technology of the human voice box, our special organ, our mouth and our breath. And I try not to be boring. I try to tell you what I hear when I write the poems. But I'd be disappointed if you just said, oh, Pinsky reads his poem so well. Despair. I'd rather read them well than poorly, but I don't believe Emily Dickinson necessarily would have been a hit on the poetry reading circuit. And she's a very great artist. And you'll see a Chinese immigrant. You'll see a young kid, I think her name is Yan Lin, in the videos. She reads Emily Dickinson's I'm Nobody, Who Are You? This is a kid who's very aware that she's a stereotypical Asian 9th or 10th grader. She does the violin, she does the piano, she does this, she does that, she gets all A's, she's popular. And then she reads, I'm Nobody, Who Are You? And by the way, she reads it in Atlanta, in that park in front of that Monument Mountain. And there are the traitors to the United States, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee. They're on their horses. And this kid loves the park. And I may think they're traitors. I may find that very ironic. She'll make up her mind what she thinks about it. And she is Emily Dickinson's collaborator. And I'll recommend that video. But there are about 60 of them there. And by the way, we want to shoot more. There's a red button that says donate. You'll help us at least every July. It'll be the 17th to the 21st this year. We do a Poetry Teaching Institute for K through 12 educators. And they're at 4 teachers in favoritepoem.org. And basically, my poet friends and I talk about poems we like. And it's to encourage teachers to be in the spirit of those videos, to teach poetry as an art, not as how do you interpret it and what does it mean. You get an appetite for interpretation after encountering it. So that's a long answer, but believe me, it's an ardent one, and I like that question. Yes? Maybe just a little louder, maybe if you... I will comment on the controversy about cultural appropriation. I hate the very concept. In my opinion, all culture is appropriation. So I'm an extremist on that question. I think culture is by its nature impure. And if the kids at Oberlin think Oberlin is appropriating some Hispanic culture by serving tacos, I'm willing to bet that if you went into the history of the taco, it'd be just like the history of everybody here and their family. Sooner or later, you come upon abandonment, adultery, betrayal, mix-upness, orphanage. Every cultural artifact, like every person, is the product of a lot of confusion and disarray and improvisation, as well as, purpose and all the opposites of those things. So I'm way over to one side or the other on that question. Yes?
You talked about the difference of poetry and translation and how with translation you don't necessarily have to know what comes next. Just as you said, and we hear fiction writers all the time say they never know where a book is going, where a novel will take them. I'm wondering if you always know what comes next in your poetry and if you work on one project at a time.
I think that there's the question is about suspense, basically, and surprise. And there's in writing and in reading. And there is this phenomenon we all have experienced where you see the film or read the novel or read the poem for the 100th time, and you experience the surprise or the revelation again. You experience the not knowing, even though in some other sense you know. It's a peculiarity of art and of the human mind, is that every time there's a discovery. Dickens turns out this one is related to that one, and you sort of know it, but on some emotional level, you just feel it again, as with music. You know everything that's going to happen in that etude or a whole symphony or whatever it is, that chorus of Dexter Gordon's, and then you experience it as though it just is happening for the first time. That's one of the ways you can tell it's a really terrific work of art. And writing, you're always hoping to surprise yourself. And you may have a lot of ideas and plans and purposes. And in his great essay, The Figure a Poem Makes, Frost says, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. That you're supposed to have some discovery as well as some plan. I don't want to overstay my welcome, so, okay, yes, this better be good. This is the last question. This has to be great. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and if you picture the straight... The first thing for a poet is the melody of the sentences. The yabba-dibba-dibba-bba. And it's not just rhythm, it's a melody. The first thing is the melody of the sentences created by the grammar. The second thing is the truth. You want to have music and you want to have truth. There is no third thing. And the triangulation is you have a vertical. Up here is the Inferno of Dante. Up above it is whatever the Inferno of Dante embodies in the mind of God. And down here is you, doing, quote, a translation, end quote. Triangulation is you realize I have to make this credible as having been written a long time ago, but also to sound like American English. You find the right pitch for it. And that word of triangulation, you're going to take an angle, is the same as this is all my experience, this is what I think, this is what I believe. And trying to make music about it, I'm hoping I'll find a new truth about it. So I'm moving over to the side. It's a similar image. Thanks a lot.